Great, thanks everyone for coming back. Hope you all enjoyed your lunch. My email address is there on the screen again. As I said, if you want copies of the slides, or if you'd like a PDF version of that Owen book that I mentioned at the end, please do drop me a line. If you do try to look for it on Amazon, don't be confused by the other books with very, very similar names. Banner of Truth is this terrible habit of taking self-explanatory titles like Eshcol and calling it Duties of Church Fellowship. I mean, Eshcol tells you everything you need to know about that book. Very peculiar. So anyway, the other one is called Guide to Church Fellowship. That's the one you want to look for if you want to look for it there. For Kindle, if you want a PDF, just email me and I'd be really happy to share it. So we've thought about yesterday the broad context really of the rise of Congregationalism, and it's a very messy, very complicated affair, and it's closely linked to revolutions in church and state, of course. And then this morning we've thought in a really interesting way, I hope, through Zach and Martin, about how Owen's practice and theory is developing through successive decades of his life. And what I want to do in this final session now is to think not about Owen's theory of church life or church governance, congregational practice, but actually the way in which he put it into reality, how theory turns into practice. I want to begin with this quotation. It's from a sermon he preached on the 8th of September 1682, so it's one of the last sermons we have from him. Christ has instituted a beautiful order in his church, if it were discovered and improved. And I have wished sometimes I could live to see it, but I do not think I shall. It's quite a statement for someone who spent so much of his life defining, debating what a church ought to look like, and then as a church leader. I've wished sometimes I could live to see it, but I do not think I shall. I want to begin with this quotation because it helps us humanize Owen, I think. Sometimes the Owen that we hear about is this kind of Marvel type superhero who's constantly right, always on the button, he's always got a pithy response, kind of the James Bond of the Puritan world in some ways. He's also formed a metal band. Have you seen that on YouTube? I mean, his accomplishments continue. But it's also, I think, really helpful for us to realise that he is someone in a church with ideals that he can't quite bring to fruition. He has a vision for the national church that he just can't see realised. He loves the church, he serves the church, he tries to be faithful through these constantly changing circumstances, but he can never quite get the church that he leads to where he thinks it ought to be. He's not always able to realise his ideals. And of course, that reminds us of this quotation from a review of the true nature of schism from Owen. It's not what men say, but what they do that they shall be judged by. It's very easy to say the right thing, have the right opinion, but it's much more difficult to try to implement it either in your own life or in the life of the fellowship of which you are a part. I want to take a liberty here with Zach and Martin being here and just talk a little bit about this project, because the project which we've mentioned a couple of times, which will hopefully be published towards the end of the year, is a project that I'm really going to be drawing on in this afternoon's presentation. The sermons of John Owen, Notes from the Congregation, 2 volumes, edited by Martin Calvin Cowan. That's how reformed he actually is. Me and Zach, and it's absolutely right that Martin's name comes first. He's really led and driven this project forward at all stages, so it's not just an alphabetical priority. Martin, we're really grateful for everything you've done to make this possible. Here's a glimpse into the inside of the 2 volumes, and you'll see there's maybe 70 new sermons. Some of them are undated. Lots of them we've got very precise dates for, but these are proofs. Please don't put any of this on social media. I'm just letting you see what it looks like now, hopefully to whet your appetite for what may be to come. Probably the most important thing, well actually the most important thing in this edition, apart from the sermons themselves, is this chronology that Martin has been working on. You'll know from his presentations he loves chronologies, but this is the chronology that will become the spine of all future work on Owen. Because Martin has gone through here listing every single sermon or preaching opportunity that we know about in Owen's life, giving a text where we have a text, a location where we have a location, a transcription source where those are available, and this is the most complete record of Owen's preaching that I think there could be available. And you'll see there on the right-hand column that Martin has matched it to manuscript sources. He's also matched it to printed versions, some of which are 17th, some of which are 18th, some of which are 19th century. And there's just a huge amount of detail in there that I think will be extremely helpful to us in the future. If you're reading Owen, you're probably reading Owen in the green Banner of Truth edition, unless you're picking up those really attractive Crossway books as they come off the press. There'll be 40 altogether, but most of us probably are still using the Banner of Truth edition. The project that I've just mentioned to you, the Sermons of John Owen project, is a project bringing to readers the first new Owen material since 1855. The project will double almost the number of sermons that we have available from Owen. I want to speak for a few moments really about how these books have come to be, and one of the ways we have to do that is really by thinking about William Gould himself. It's kind of an irony, I suppose, that we owe our edition of Owen to a Reformed Presbyterian minister. Gould was a minister in the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Scotland, and later moved into the Free Church of Scotland when that denomination, or most of it, moved into the larger group. He was the son-in-law of William Symington. If you know anything about Scottish historical theology, Symington is a major figure thinking about the mediatorial rule of Christ and so on. As we worked through this editorial project, we began to discover in some kind of unlikely locations bits and pieces that showed us how Gould had put his edition together. Here's the prospectus. This is what was going out to potential subscribers. If William Gould and the publishers saying, if you'd like to see this edition come to fruition, please support it. Give it some financial backing up front, and that will help us bring it to realisation. And we discovered papers like this. This is Gould's working document, as he has in one column the number of pages per Owen title in an earlier 19th century edition edited by Thomas Russell, and he's making a projection then of how large, how much space each of these titles would need in the edition that he was bringing out. And you can see he's calculating words, he's calculating pages, how many volumes there ought to be, how many pages per volume, and so on. Now, the interesting thing about Gould is he didn't work from original sources, as far as we can tell. He's working from the Thomas Russell edition, which means he's replicating mistakes that were made earlier on in the 19th century. So, for example, here is a slide showing you a final page in the manuscript of Owen's book, 12 Arguments Against Any Conformity, first published in 1720. But what we discover when we go and look at the manuscript of this is that it's not exclusively Owen's work. He's listed there with a number of other people. Now, Gould, when he sat and worked through some of the manuscripts that we also worked through, became quite an intrusive editor. So you'll see here notes taken on a sermon by Owen on Romans 1:16. You'll see the title there just under the top red line, Dr. Owen, May 20th, 1670, sermon the first, Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, etc. And then in red brackets, there is this statement: I thought fit at present to divert my thoughts to this portion of Scripture, wherein in like occasions, as we may and have been exercised with, I have formerly found satisfaction. So that tells us something really interesting. It tells us that Owen is preaching a series on something else, and he's cutting into that series to speak about Romans 1:16. I think from memory there's 3 sermons on that title. But Gould lifts all out. He just puts a red line through it essentially and removes all this contextual information that we today would probably find quite interesting. Now, along the way, Zach, sitting at the back, stumbled upon some completely unknown Owen material in a notebook at Yale University. And these were notes taken by auditors listening to him preach, we think probably from the early 1650s through into the early part of his public ministry. Together with other manuscripts, we then had a record of sermons unpublished ranging from about 1651 almost to Owen's death, ranging right up to 1682. What these records reveal is that Owen's relationship with his congregation in the 1670s and early 80s became increasingly strained, and also that he was never able to put his theory of church practice, church life, church order completely into practice. Now, Owen has left a fair amount of manuscript material, or his ministry, I should say, has left a fair amount of manuscript material behind. Here is the church book, the parish records, from his first parish in Fordham in Essex. Owen becomes pastor in 1643. You see there at the top of the page, John Owen, pastor, Anno Domini, July 1643. And some historians have said, well, this is Owen signing the book, and it's significant that he's describing himself as pastor instead of priest. In fact, this isn't Owen's writing at all, so he's not talking about himself at all. What's really interesting about this page is here is his son John being baptised, a record of baptisms. Then there are similar records in the second parish in Cogswell in Essex, and you can get a sense here of how crowded some of these manuscript records are. This is a record of Owen's daughter Mary, named after her mum, called Mary. So Owen's daughter Mary being baptised on the 18th of July 1647. Skip forward a few pages and you get a record of her death and burial exactly 1 week later. And so there's a lot of humanity in these books. We know that Owen and his wife Mary have a number of children, all of whom die by about 1649, and the house which had children in it is again empty. And it's in that moment of an empty house that Owen puts together a little book called The Primer, which is also not in the Gould edition, which is his little book of prayers for children. In a home in which they buried their children, he's thinking about teaching children to pray. Now, there are other records of Owen's ministry from this period, including really interesting material from his neighbour and friend Ralph Jocelyn. Ralph Jocelyn's the parish minister next door, and his diary is both tragic and hilariously funny by turns. And it's a diary that's just full of gossip about life in the area, about the weather, about dinner parties with John Owen, what they talk about. That's kind of interesting. And Ralph Jocelyn, just, you know, as the slightly less successful, who becomes increasingly less successful neighbour, is watching John Owen's ascension into the spheres of power with some degree of criticism. So here is Ralph Jocelyn's diary recording the installation of John Sams from New England as co-pastor or pastor of the Cogswell parish in 1652. And Ralph Jocelyn, good Presbyterian that he is quite disturbed that Owen is installing John Sams but not following the Directory of Public Worship of the Westminster Assembly. Sams was set apart that day with fasting and prayer to be a teaching elder of the church at Cogswell. He made a confession of faith. There was no open consent of the church, nor no acceptance of it with any words, nor promise to do anything. The messengers, that is, pastors of 3 churches, gave their approbation of the act and were witnesses of the church's act. 1 gave an exhortation, 2 prayed for a blessing, and then they all went off for a cup of tea. So that's Essex. And then, as I said to you earlier on, we don't really have any record of Owen being part of any church in the 1650s until we come to the Wallingford House congregation, which is both a religious community, a Christian fellowship, meeting in Wallingford House, and also a quasi-political sect who've got an agreed agenda for what they want to see, and the relationship between church fellowship and political movement becomes extremely close. And as I mentioned to you, we've got some records of Philip Nye preaching the sermon at Owen's installation in that church in 1658. That's Wallingford House, the home of Charles Fleetwood. A couple of years later, in the very different circumstances of the early Restoration, when dissenters are really being pushed to the margins, Charles Fleetwood's next house, Fleetwood House, becomes the centre of another congregation that Owen will lead. And just like the Wallingford House congregation, the Fleetwood House congregation will have a very distinct political culture or character. It's made up of washed-up revolutionaries, Republicans who don't fit in this new monarchical world, who are coming together as old friends, sometimes even old rivals, but realising how dangerous the world around them has become and how much they need to depend upon each other in this brave new world to survive. And so we have a list dated in June 1673 of the 30 or so members of that little house church in Fleetwood House in Stoke Newington. I mentioned earlier on today that one of the hosts of that house, Sir John Hartop, the son of Charles Fleetwood and his wife, who was John Hartop's mother, sort of a complicated blended family situation. It's kind of hard to remember, never mind explain. But Sir John Hartop took extensive notes on Owen's preaching, and I mentioned too, he also took extensive notes on Benjamin Cox, Hansard Knowles. We know Henry Danvers is preaching in the house as well. Later on, Hartop keeps taking notes. He takes notes all the way through into the early 1690s, I think, as far as we can tell. He takes extensive notes on David Clarkson, which had never been published, which Martin and I are working on an edition of. There's other notes in there from Increase Mather, who comes from New England into the church in Leadenhall Street and preaches a number of sermons in there. So there's a huge repository of these sermons from this single congregation, which have never been published. Here we've got a page from the Leadenhall Street Church Book. Now, you saw a couple of slides ago the church books from Essex. They record births or baptisms, marriages and deaths. A congregational church book serves a completely different purpose. It doesn't record life events, it records congregational events. It records admission and demission from the congregation dating from 1673 forward into the early ministry of Isaac Watts. We can trace under the ministry of Owen of this combined congregation from 1673 to his death in 83 that the membership grows very, very quickly in the early years and then stabilises. There's about 25% growth in around 5 years, and then it begins to plateau and eventually begins to decline. Really interesting that most people who seem to join Owen's congregation do so as individuals. There's not too many examples of married couples that we can trace, and there, as far as we can see, are next to no examples of multi-generational families. It's either single people who may, I suppose, in the circumstances of the time, have been widowed. Perhaps we know certainly in some cases that one spouse is joining but not another. But there's hardly any examples of mum, dad, and a couple of kids. Hardly any examples at all. So again, think about what's happening here. Owen has this theology of covenant. He has expectations of covenant blessing and so on. But think about the way that people are joining or not joining this church, and the groups in which they present themselves to the church to present their conversion narrative and to be adjudged as worthy or not worthy of admission. In this church book, there are no examples of baptisms. There's no record of baptisms. That's probably because Owen develops a view that baptism happens before church membership, and it's not really part of the life of the fellowship. He talks about this in some of his writings, that baptism happens outside the church and people are brought into the church through the testimony of conversion that they offer. There's hardly any discipline cases. When they do happen, they tend to happen at the very end of his ministry, and there's a number of examples of people who leave, sometimes to cross the Atlantic, either to the Caribbean or New England, and one example of a person who leaves for the Baptists. And there's no indication that that note left for the Baptists indicates any kind of church discipline at play. It's simply being accepted. They're moving to another type of Christian church. So people are collecting Owen's sermons. Sometimes they're working individually, sometimes they're working in groups. There's a number of manuscript books up in Edinburgh University which show that people are swapping sermons. So you're collecting some sermons, your friend is collecting some other ones, you missed a couple of Sundays, you want to catch up, and you swap your transcripts and you can gradually build up your collection. Now, Sir John Hartop, who we are mostly depending on in this project, collected around 70 sermon transcripts, some of which he traded with one of his friends, a much younger man called John Asty. John Asty really begins the production, the publication of Owen's works in the 1720s. But other people who are not church members are also collecting Owen's work. Someone like Lucy Hutchinson, for example, who is a poet, the widow of John Hutchinson. She writes a very moving memoir of her late husband, who she obviously adores. She writes a memoir of him. She writes the first epic poem by a woman in English, a poem called Order and Disorder. And it's a poem that really depends upon Owen's great Latin work, The Leguma Pantadapa, and turns it into poetry. In fact, she also translates some of Owen's work from Latin into English as well, but she never joins, which is interesting. Here's an example of her note-taking. It's not too hard to read. You could probably do it if you looked at it carefully. Just gives you a sense of what we're doing. Why are these sermon notes interesting? They're interesting for Owen because he uses them too. Owen preaches, as far as we can tell, in an almost extempore fashion. And people are taking very, very detailed notes in shorthand and then turning them into longhand. And Owen tells us his practice is to preach from short notes and then to consult the notes of his auditors to make sure that he's not preaching one sermon and then printing another. What does he mean by that statement? He means that he is taking week by week the material he delivers in his sermons and he's turning it into books. How does Owen write so much? Everyone always asks that question. We'll find out in a moment or two. He prints around 8 million words. His ministry is over 40 years. Let's say he preaches one 4,000 word sermon text every week for 40 years. Hey presto, 8 million words. How many times a week do you guys preach? 2, 3? 3,000, 4,000 words, probably normal. What if you just published them? Just phone up Banner of Truth. Guys, I'm available. I've got 8 million words. Now that Reformation Heritage are competing, they're looking for new material. So, Owen has several ecclesiological theories, and what we're going to think about today is whether there could be gaps between these theories and his practice. I'm stealing this visual from the introduction to our edition, but it's a really helpful visual, I think, which helps you understand who Owen is working with in his church. So remember, Owen's church is a house church until the summer of 1673, when it combines with this much bigger church, over which an individual called Robert Viner is a ruling elder. Joseph Carroll has died, Viner remains, and Viner and Owen are now both elders, a pastor and a ruling elder of the new church. But the church is big, and Owen has been used to small churches. And so within a few months, by December, the church has called Isaac Loaves as a teacher. We don't know very much about Isaac Loaves. We'll talk about these guys in a second. About 6 months after that, the church calls Robert Ferguson as a teacher too. He's a very troubled individual. And these individuals come and go. Viner dies in January 1677. Loaves outlives Owen, past Owen's death in 1683. Ferguson joins in 74 and leaves in 79, but tries to engineer a return, which goes nowhere. And then towards the very end of his life, when Owen is supported only by Isaac Loaves with no ruling elders, David Clarkson joins. Sometimes in presentations or books, you hear Clarkson described as Owen's young assistant. In fact, Clarkson is only about 2 or 3 years younger than Owen. He had a very distinguished career up until the Restoration. After the Restoration, he basically goes into retirement and writes these really long, complicated books about the early church's ecclesiology, which you might be interested in, which have never been republished really since the 19th century. So what do we learn from this? Never mind Owen's theory. What's he actually doing? After summer 1673, Owen is almost always part of a pastoral team. He inherits an elder, a ruling elder from Joseph Carroll. 6 months later, the combined church appoints Isaac Loaves, who doesn't seem to be a preacher in great demand. If the note-taking record is any evidence to go by, there's not too many people taking notes of what he is preaching. In November 74, the church appoints Robert Ferguson, who is a much younger man. The problem with Robert Ferguson is that during the early 1660s, he has been a government spy against dissenters. So he has been turned by the government to be an informer. We don't know if Owen knew this or if the congregation knew this when he was appointed teacher. But these are the pressures that are on some of these individuals as they work through this incredibly complicated time. And then in July 1682, as Owen is really weakening and really needing support, the church calls David Clarkson to come and be a support to him. So Owen's pastoral work is mostly supported by 2 teachers. But while Owen was never on his own as an elder after summer 1673, he did remain the congregation's only pastor. He was the only one who was able to dispense the sacraments. His elder office colleagues were mostly teachers. They were there to preach. That was their duty in the church. He was never involved, as far as we can tell, in the election of any ruling elder. He inherits one from Joseph Carroll, and that's enough. And when Viner dies, there's no ruling elder appointed in his place. As far as we can tell, Owen was never involved in the election of a deacon. There are 2 deacons that run through this period, but 2 in a church that's growing to 220 or thereabouts. They could be both quite busy, I would imagine. What were the challenges? There are hints of problems among the leaders, or disagreements, I should say, among these elders. I'll give you an example. 22nd of September 1682, Samuel Shute, who's one of the church members, who's a very prominent businessman in London, a very wealthy individual, and is interested in politics in this very tumultuous period. He gets arrested and then bailed. So think of what's happening in 1682. Talked about it earlier on. Everything looks like the Reformation is coming into a crisis. And there's enormous political and legal pressure on London dissenters. And one of the most prominent people in the church has just been arrested. And it looks like Owen and Clarkson call the church together to do something about this. Owen complains, half of you are not here today. And those that have bothered to come have been so careless and negligent, you've come so late. Here's a church in crisis. One of the most prominent members has just been arrested. Half the people can't come. And those that do come late. It's really interesting trying to read between the lines here, and the danger is reading too much between the lines, of course. One of the things that Zach was arguing earlier on is that, in his writing as well, is that Owen becomes increasingly radical, politically radical through this period. And there is, I think, a sense that he is disappointed in the church fellowship over which he is leading. They're not responding in faith or with diligence to his pastoral guidance through this time of crisis. And there's hints that Owen is now positioning himself in these later months of his life with a group which includes his brother, Henry Owen, possibly Robert Ferguson, coordinating from the Netherlands, where he's currently a pastor, and other radicals to begin a plot. And the plot is a coup. It's no secret that Owen gets arrested in the spring of 1683, just a few months before he dies, on suspicion of being involved in a plot against the life of the king and his brother, the Catholic heir to the throne, James the Duke of York. The plot was that as they came back from racing, someone would throw a hand grenade and they'd be blown up. It doesn't happen. But the plot gets exposed. And one by one, conspirators are rounded up and arrested, including Owen. Was he guilty? He said he wasn't. But he was implicated by others who were almost certainly guilty. And by the evidential standards of the day, Owen would almost certainly have been found guilty in court. So this is a very strange world that Owen is working in, and his congregation is not supporting him. But on the very same day, David Clarkson preaches a sermon, one of the unpublished Clarkson sermons, and David Clarkson's tone is completely different. Yes, we have enemies, he says to the congregation, and it's true that they hate us and want the worst for us. But that's more their problem than it is our problem. And if we do have enemies, we don't need to conspire against them, Clarkson says, because Jesus tells us what to do to our enemies. Love them. Find ways to love and pray for these people who want to destroy us. And that's a very powerful sermon from Clarkson when you read it in context, because as Martin has uncovered, people are literally taking pot shots at members of Owen's congregation, including Hartop, as they are going around. The hatred against dissenters at this point is leading to real violence. Christians should do nothing that's unlawful Clarkson says, nothing that's doubtfully evil, either to prevent or remove the calamity approaching. That's not the way to escape. To try to resist this is to have the Lord proceed more severely against you. So there are differences in opinion maybe, or differences in approach between the leaders of Owen's church. The other thing I think we can see in these sermons is that Owen didn't always get his own way. Martin talked about this, I mentioned it earlier on as well. Sometimes Owen addressed issues that caused serious problems in his congregation. December 1679, the Scottish Covenanters are being massacred. They're being shipped off to the colonies as slaves. There's problems in New England with security there as well. Owen argues the church needs to renew its covenant. The church members refuse to do so. Why do they refuse to do so? This is fascinating. Some of them, Owen says, refuse to renew the covenant because they don't have assurance of salvation. They don't have assurance of salvation. And yet they're members of a congregational church in which you're to give a testimony of your conversion story and you're receiving assurance of salvation to join. But now there's this large group, and maybe they've come through the Joseph Carroll Church, who don't have assurance of salvation. Others say, we're not going to subscribe the covenant, we're not going to renew the covenant because we don't know how to do it. Should we do it the way the Scottish Covenanters do? Or should we do it in the New England manner? Well, remember Robert Newman, I mentioned him before, in 1639 in his barn, he had established the covenant that founded the city of New Haven, Connecticut. And now he's a member of Owen's church. And he's got a view of how you should renew the covenant. And maybe others have a different view of how you should renew the covenant. So what should Owen do? He's proposed a way forward for the church. The members refused. Well, Owen had already considered the possibility that that the members of a church could refuse guidance from its leaders. Here's a paragraph from a brief instruction in the worship of God, 1667. If it be asked, Owen said, what shall the elders do in case the church refuse to consent unto such acts as are indeed according to the rule and warranted by the institution of Christ? It's answered, Owen says, they should diligently instruct the congregation from the word in their duty, making known the mind of Christ. Secondly, declare unto them the danger of their dissent in obstructing the edification of the body. Thirdly, he says, wait patiently for the concurrence of the grace of God with your ministry to give light to the church. And fourthly, he says, in case of the church's continuing in any failure of duty, get advice from your colleagues elsewhere. Get support from ministers, elders, and brethren elsewhere. And that's exactly what Owen does. He comes in the next couple of months really to keep pressing this duty of renewing the congregational covenant. And he tells the people in the church, listen, I've gone and talked to my friends elsewhere in London, and they agree this is something we really must do. We really need to renew the covenant. And by May 1680, Martin discovered, he's been at least partially successful. Many of us, not all of us, that's interesting, many of us as have afresh engaged ourselves in covenant unto God. So a lot of debate about this covenant, and oddly, it doesn't seem to survive. We don't actually know what was in it. So Owen faces real problems in the congregation. A dreadful coldness, an incurable coldness has befallen the professors of this age, he says. A shower of rain is able to keep off great numbers from the best and choicest opportunities. Look at the bottom there. Whence is it that not half our congregation is present at this day? And those that come carelessly, negligently, slothfully late. This is the day of crisis. Look at the bottom of that paragraph. I know that there are opinions arising among us, among professors generally, against the necessity of family prayer. So don't think that Owen's congregation is some kind of spiritual utopia. There's people who are not leading their families in daily worship. There's people who come late to church. There's people who look out and see the rain and think, maybe I'll tune in and get the YouTube broadcast. And Owen never quite gets his way with sacraments either. In a brief instruction in the Worship of God, 1667, he famously argues for weekly communion, that great staple theme of so many Reformed writers who never seem quite to be able to put it into practice. And there's no evidence in any of the records available to us that Owen was ever able to put it into practice either. Wonder what it was like to be in his congregation, knowing that he is telling the world what a church ought to be like, but that the church you're actually part of is a little bit different Must be kind of interesting. Owen reminds us that it's not what men say, but what men do that they will be judged by. And all of us, of course, need the grace and mercy of God as we think this through. What encouragements can we get from Owen as we think about his experience of church life? For me, one of the really striking lessons is that he seems to prefer small churches. He seems to be happy in the small church in the house in Stoke Newington, in Fleetwood House. It seems that he's not quite sure how to create a new culture when the small house church blends with the big church that used to belong to Joseph Carroll or be under his oversight. Joseph Carroll, of course, famously preached through Job over 40 years. And it's really striking that even Owen's interest in doing short sermon series stops in June 1673. It's as if Carroll's church has sort of said, we've had enough. And, maybe 2 or 3 weeks and Romans 1:16 is sufficient. But in the sermon in June 1673, the sermon that combines the churches, Owen preaches a very powerful discourse on love. And in that sermon, Owen makes the point that he would rather see a church held together by love, by grace, than by gift. What did he mean? He wanted the church to survive its celebrity preachers. Amen. He wanted the church to love each other and care for each other, so that even if the celebrity preacher dies or is replaced, the church is absolutely moving forward as one body. That's a great lesson for us. We live in an incredibly Corinthian age. So-and-so, what a gifted preacher. Is that really what we should be measuring? One says it's graces, not gifts, that are the measure of sanctification. Anyone can be a great preacher. Judas was a great preacher. He worked miracles. Did he have grace? And so one of the things that Owen does in the big church in Leadenhall Street, as I said before, he tries to replicate the small church experience for this big church membership. He encourages them, meet locally, just meet together, pray, encourage one another. You really need to do this. It's not enough just to come to church, to the big gatherings of the Lord's people. Meet together in small groups and pray. And he calls for that repeatedly. Owen had big expectations of small churches. The biggest, the most impressive things that he wrote in this period came out of sermons to tiny groups of people meeting in a house, including the longest commentary in Hebrews that has ever been published. And that's where it arose, in a house church of 30 people. Owen knew that small churches were big responsibilities. I shared this quotation with you already, but it's worth repeating. If men would but a little seriously consider what there is in the care of souls, they would be content to lead a small church. They wouldn't seek the additional responsibility of giving account for numbers of people who they could not possibly know. Owen matters to us, I think. He matters to me because he was faithful in small things. He didn't despise the day of small things. When he's meeting with 30 people in a house church, he doesn't say, let's just have fellowship time and a cup of tea. He takes the opportunity to deliver the word of God. He is faithful in the day of small things. And then he learns, because of that he who is faithful in little is faithful in much. And his ministry to 30 people is impacting millions of people today. So Owen says, as he is dying, Christ has instituted a beautiful order in his church, if we could discover it and do it. I have wished sometimes I could live to see it, but I do not think I shall. Will we? Let's pray and work for exactly that. Thank you, Doug.